Welcome back, and I hope if you're in my class, you enjoyed the last series of lectures in our first in-class meeting. And if you somehow found these videos on YouTube, my name's Sean Jordan. I'm a professional marketing researcher and also a member of the SIUE Master of Marketing Research program. And this is the first part of our second lecture series for a class on qualitative research for marketing researchers. In our previous lecture series, we talked about what separates qualitative research from quantitative research and how they relate to the broader scientific method and philosophy of scientific inquiry. But now we're going to focus more narrowly on how qualitative research is used for marketing research and how we can design qualitative studies to deliver good, reliable, actionable insights. Now, I actually had this strange experience a few years ago where, and I rarely do this, but I flew into a city where I'd never been before and didn't do any research on it whatsoever. And it was an event where I was speaking, so I was actually driven to my hotel by a transport service, and I emerged from my hotel shortly after dark, looking for a place to go to dinner, and I had no idea where to go. I didn't have any context for where I was, and as I was walking around, I didn't even know if I was heading in the right direction or not for a place to find dinner. Though I was in the city, I couldn't see too far down any of the streets, and the people around me absolutely mystified me. One of the things I noticed right away was that many of these people appeared to be college aged, which didn't make a lot of sense to me given that the shops and stores and buildings around me didn't necessarily look like a college campus. What's more, some of the people I saw were young men with bald heads, and they were wearing completely gray outfits, like they joined some sort of outer space cult. And I saw lots of other people as well. I saw people who were riding skateboards all over the place. I saw people who looked like they were young couples out on a date. I saw people that looked like they were taking their laundry to a laundromat. And I saw people that looked like they were tourists walking up and down the streets, visiting the shops. And the shops themselves really confused me because some of them looked like they were meant to cater to locals. They had, convenience stores or shops that looked like they were more for local types of needs. But then there were others that were clearly built for tourists that had all kinds of touristy stuff and candy and things like that. I also passed by signs that specified that certain buildings were not available to the public, which I thought was kind of weird because you don't normally see that just in any city that you walk into. And I was certain I could hear and smell the ocean nearby, but I couldn't see it anywhere I went. Everywhere I looked was another street with more buildings on it. Some of the roads that I walked down looked pleasant and inviting, but others looked dangerous and frightening, despite being just blocks away from one another. And I never had a sense of whether I was in a good part of town or I was an alley away from a mugging. It wasn't until the next morning that I was able to see more clearly under the sunlight, and I could realize the type of city that I was in. And the city happened to be Charleston, South Carolina. It's a nice town that sits on a harbor. It not only has a tourist district, it also has a college downtown and a military academy called the Citadel, where the recruits have their heads shaved and they wear gray uniforms. Seeing everything in the daylight made everything make so much more sense. And from there, I was then able to go and look up information about where I was and contextualize a lot of the things I'd seen more properly. Well, as we walk through the role of the observer in qualitative research, I think that the analogy of walking down the road in an unfamiliar place on a dark night is a good one. When you're outside walking in the dark, you actually have a good sense of awareness about what's right around you, but almost everything else beyond that little sphere of awareness is shrouded in shadows. Things that are clear in the daylight become much more difficult to discern in the darkness, and it's easy for us to misinterpret things or to get scared or to assume that we're seeing things when we're actually just seeing tricks of light. Our senses are developed for daylight, not twilight, and unless we have a portable light or some local light or the glow of a full moon to help us make sense of what we're seeing, wandering around in the darkness can cause us to invent a reality that's shaped heavily by our perceptions. The only ways we can function effectively in the darkness are either to become familiar with what things look like in the light, to bring lights to shine on things that we need to see, or to learn to make better use of our other senses to compensate for our lack of ability to see. When we conduct research with human beings, we as researchers need to be extremely aware of how our perceptions of the world shape the reality around us. What's plainly obvious to you or I may be something that's entirely opaque to someone outside our social norms. And as I'm sure any of the international students in our class will tell you from their own experience, or any of you that have done any international travel abroad might have seen, what we often assume to be the preferred or right way to do things based on our own culture and upbringing gets called into question the moment we enter into a foreign culture where the ideas of what the right way to do things are is decidedly different and often brimming with nuance. And you don't actually have to travel far to experience this. You can just travel around different states in the United States where you can find these cultural differences become very real. But of course, if you travel to another country, I had this experience traveling to London a couple of years ago, where many things that I was used to that were my norms were just different there. And it took me a while to get acclimated to what the culture was like, even though it was very familiar in a lot of ways. But, the good news is you don't have to travel very far to learn about differences in perspective. And in America today, you actually don't even have to leave your state. There are people living on the same streets and in the same neighborhoods who can live strikingly different lives depending on a number of factors such as their level of education, their occupation, their age, their race or ethnic background, their sexual identity, their gender identity, their level of physical disability, the size of their household, whether or not they have children at home, whether or not they have elderly parents living at home, their political affiliation, their religious heritage, and so much more. It's very easy to get to know Americans as individuals. All you have to do is talk to them. They're usually very happy to share. And catering to their individual whims and desires is also pretty easy if you take the time to get to know them personally. And anybody who's ever had neighbors knows that there's certain neighbors that you have to appease in different ways in order to make them get along with you. But once you start to generalize, to assume that everyone who lives in a neighborhood must think and feel the same way about the topics that you're researching, not only are you bound to be wrong about generalizing to that group, but you're also going to introduce your own assumptions into your work and make it far more reflective of what you think than what they think if you're not careful. Now, hopefully, you've recognized that thinking about people at an individual level is kind of like qualitative thinking, right? Making broad assumptions of groups of people is a quantitative perspective. And I hope you're already thinking as well about how we as researchers have to be careful, not just in seeking our individual perspectives that match our own, but also in looking at broad groups of people and discovering patterns that fit our own way of thinking, and which can cause us to make assumptions that aren't accurate about everyone. So in our next lecture, we're going to discuss just how dangerous it can be to make these assumptions and what we as qualitative researchers can do about it.